I think that coming out of a lot of the symbolic, impactful, direct actions around the anti-globalization movement, most people went home, at least with the desire, if not actually actualizing, organizations, and organizations that were consensus-based, democratic, focusing on confronting power in a similar way, but on a more community-based level. And some of us created networks that continued to operate through a spokes council model that were national or continental, like the Continental Direct Action Network. There was also the People's Global Action Network. There were different entities that attempted to continue to collaborate using a consensus-based model. But I think a lot of people went home, and that was the organizing model that felt like it embodied the politics that we were wanting to create. And so most people went home and created organizations. I think that part of the problem is adapting those models to other scenarios. In terms of a direct action, mass action, yes, we don't want a whole lot of, police provocateurs or police in our meetings, but the idea of having a closed meeting means that you're missing out on all of the people who are going to be radicalized by that moment, by that participation, all of the people that are going to find your flyer, have never done anything political in their life, or maybe not in 20 years because they've been so, beaten down by the Reagan era, and they come into that meeting and then they're re-engaged. And the trade-off is worth it, of really just engaging everyone, which means you're engaging people that are incredibly difficult to work with, that may have their own personal agendas, that may not know how to share space and just dominate meetings, and it takes really strong facilitation to kind of guide meetings in ways that hold space open for everyone. There's a lot of, screwy personalities that you're having to contend with. And I think people went home from those experiences where that was appropriate and welcome because of what we stand to gain by having gigantic open meetings, and tried to take that exact model and plunk it into a more long-term organizational model. And sometimes that worked. New York City Direct Action Network, we existed for 2 years like that. But it could also be really frustrating, to have people wandering off the street, anybody, and kind of they're part of it as soon as they're there. And I think what happened was people regarded consensus or equated consensus with open, full consensus, anything goes in terms of sort of building community in this way, got really frustrated and didn't want to have anything to do with consensus, and so, or open forms of organizing, and decided just to have small affinity groups, and not necessarily even coordinate between affinity groups. Oftentimes, in later days, people would want to have a mass action where people would just arrive and you do your stuff and another group would do their thing, and the idea is it would sort of all create a whole without any process around decision making and dialogue between the groups. I mean, for me, the motivation around consensus process, which I don't think is appropriate for all situations and every moment, but I think the motivation for me is really in listening and in really understanding where people are coming from, because if you don't, if you engage in other forms of decision making, it's easy to not really understand where people are coming from, and then you don't learn anything. And particularly around issues of power, giving voice and equal weight to people, and having to find a scenario where people feel comfortable in participating, which is not a given. You can have a meeting of 60 people where only 10 people really feel empowered to speak. And part of consensus, it's not about the actual decision, but actually the process of getting there. Creating a space where you have 60 voices in the room and you really understand where they are and you're taking the time and the space for that. To me, direct democracy, which is the term I usually use, is a spiritual principle, because I think to truly believe in democracy, you have to believe in the potential of people not only to be rational, but to be good. Not that everybody comes to the table that way, but that given the time and space for people to actually hear each other and understand where each other's coming from, that will make decisions that are good. And I think that direct democracy requires a faith in humanity. And I think having that experience and having successful experiences with that is tremendously inspiring in terms of your outlook on the world. You know, if you believe that our leaders are the only people that can make sane decisions, and that coming together and hearing from each other is really just a waste of time, because most people, you know, have really backwards ideas and, you know, are just really out for themselves, you're going to have a pretty bleak experience of the world and not a particularly hopeful world to work towards. So I think engaging in that experiment, having success with it, which is not always the case, but having a lot of experiences that are positive, particularly when you're making decisions with people who are very different from yourself, or who may come to the table with issues that you haven't thought through. And particularly those moments where at first you perceive the person coming with an obstructionist attitude, and you've got an idea that somebody's just, you know, being unreasonable, and then you realize that your perspective didn't allow you to see their reason, and you then have learned from them and understand where conflict comes from, a lot of just really not taking the space to see that. One particular incident that I remember, I don't even remember what we were organizing around. It may have been the 2000 Republican National Convention in Philly. We were having organizing meetings in New York City, and there was sort of a standoff between two activists, and one of them was a woman of color from the Bronx who invited everyone to a meeting and was upset that some people didn't want to come to her church to this meeting, and thought that it was really sort of anti-spiritualist, anarchist crap that was, you know, was sort of a hardened opinion in her perspective that was sort of creating people's resistance to meeting in a church. And later on in the meeting, when we actually really talked about it, it became clear that the woman that was most vocal in not wanting to be there was not wanting to be there because the church that they were in regarded her and her queerness as being an abomination and didn't feel comfortable being in that space. And it was interesting to see those walls sort of coming down and realizing that there was, you know, that there was learning around that. And I certainly didn't see that. I would never have thought that meeting in a church would be difficult for, you know, for a queer activist who felt really strongly about being welcome as a whole person in the spaces that she was in. Whereas this woman of color, I know, felt similarly in a lot of white activist spaces and really wanted to bust a lot of the white activists out of their comfort zone and take them up to her community in a place that was important to her. So it was kind of an, you know, interesting moment. Many of them like that. But I think without those experiences, without having moments where you're actually forced to engage with each other, you would have just left that experience thinking the other was closed-minded and not someone you wanted to work with.